Thank you for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event. Welcome to everyone watching live on Zoom and Facebook, and to those who are watching the replay on JA Community Radio and on YouTube. My name is Robert Gregory. I'm the CEO of AJA. Our guest tonight is Peter Jennings, OAM. Peter is a leading defense analyst providing strategic advice to both the public and private sector. He's a columnist for the Australian newspaper and a director of the think tank Strategic Analysis Australia. Very honoured to have Peter tonight, and a reminder, we'll be doing a Q&A in the second half. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand with the reaction button. I'm going to hand over to David Adler, President of the AJA, who will lead tonight's proceedings.
Okay, Peter, thank you, and welcome to the Australian Jewish Association. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, David.
Peter, for those of us who are not familiar with your work and what you've done, can you just say a little about yourself from a professional perspective?
Somewhat to my dismay, David, I realise I'm now a 36-year veteran of living in Canberra. I originally came here to study international politics, and I ended up teaching politics at the Defence Academy, the military university in Canberra, and fairly early on gave up on the idea of an academic career to go into the defence policy world more directly. And so I've had a long career in the Defence Department in a variety of roles, a couple of stints in two of our intelligence agencies, the Office of National Intelligence, as it's now called, and also our imagery organisation, which gathers satellite intelligence. But more of my career has been around developing strategic policy. And in defence, I guess my most senior job was Deputy Secretary for Strategy. I was very closely involved with our military forces and planning our operations in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I've also spent a fair amount of time working up in Parliament House, a long list of politicians that I've worked for, Alexander Downer in opposition years when John Hewson was leader. Then I was Chief of Staff to Ian McLaughlin, who was the first Defence Minister in the Howard government, and a couple of years working for John Howard directly as his senior advisor for strategic policy. Some people may know of me more recently because I ran a place called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for a decade.
ASPI, as it's known.
Which is a think tank that's designed to try and lift the quality of the public debate around defence and international security issues. After 10 years, I thought I'd probably should hand that to someone else. So for the last couple of years, I've been working as a consultant, mostly consulting into the private sector around defence and security. And with my good friend and colleague, Michael Shoebridge, we run Strategic Analysis Australia, which is a small think tank, not publicly funded, that also works on defence issues. And then finally, people may read my columns in the Australian. I'm pretty much a weekly columnist and have been almost for a decade now writing for the Oz. So a career in and around defence and security in a variety of different ways, pretty close to the Canberra political scene. I've worked with, in one shape or another, every defence minister we've had since Ken Beazley.
And even the occasional appearance on Sky News, Peter.
Making the occasional appearance on Sky News, less the ABC. They don't seem to ask me so much, David. I don't know quite why that would be the case, but something we could talk about. But anyway, that's me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation and also speaking.
Well, let's get straight into a couple of specific issues very briefly. I've got a whole list, so we'll just sort of do a shopping list down. I guess a big subject that we've all heard about over the last couple of years is AUKUS, Now, everybody knows that what it stands for, that it's Australia, UK, US. The common interpretation is that it's all about buying nuclear-powered submarines. So what actually is AUKUS? What's its purpose? How important is it, Peter?
Well, certainly nuclear submarines is at the core of it. The way I think about AUKUS is that it's a pooling of the defence industrial base and science and technology bases of the US, the UK, and Australia. And really the first project, the first big cab off the rank is nuclear propulsion. And that's a significant thing because Australia is only the second country after the UK, which the Americans have chosen to give access to their nuclear propulsion technology. They did that with the Brits after the Second World War in the 1950s, and now us. When I was a defence official, David, I actually asked American officials on 3 occasions if we could get access to nuclear propulsion, and the answer each time was not simply no, but hell no. There was a distinct lack of interest in it, and also, I think, a lack of confidence that we would be able to operate the technology. And that changed, which was something that Scott Morrison negotiated with Joe Biden and Boris Johnson from the UK. It's also worth mentioning that there's something in AUKUS called Pillar 2, which is everything other than submarines, and it's about a whole raft of new or newish and emerging military technology, from quantum computing to hypersonics. Hypersonics is anything that can move faster than Mach 5 times the speed of sound, through to cyber technology and a range of other things. And at least the design of AUKUS was intended to sort of, create a common research framework between the 3 countries to try and speed the delivery of these exotic military technologies into military service. I regret to say it's not moving as fast as it should. And maybe we can talk about that, but it's kind of being stifled in the bureaucracies of the 3 countries, not least Australia. But that's the idea of it, and in a sense, a certain amount of risk reduction, because if you've got 3 countries working on these technologies together, that perhaps makes it less risky than if only one, particularly a small country like Australia, is undertaking the work. So that's AUKUS. I think it's probably the most significant step forward in terms of the architecture of our security since the signing of the ANZUS Treaty in 1951. So that makes it significant, but all of the delivery is in front of us in all of those areas.
So we understand that the submarines will be nuclear powered, and that's a very important step up in terms of our potential defence capability. But we're also told that they will not carry nuclear weapons. So what sort of weapons will they carry, and how effective will they be, compared to, the other subs that are out there, Chinese or whatever we might come up against?
Yeah. So these are going to be attack submarines designed primarily to sink the Navy, sink the other submarines and the surface ships of an enemy. And the value of atomic propulsion is that these submarines can operate at sea for potentially months at a time. With conventional submarines like the Collins class, the amount of time they can actually spend underwater on operations is limited by the capacity of the submarine to snort for oxygen. And that means to say they have a much lesser amount of time being hidden underwater. With nuclear submarines, the propulsion is virtually indefinite. It's only the sanity of the crew and the food stocks which really force it to come back to harbour. What weapons will they have? They'll have torpedoes, extremely long-range modern torpedoes. They will have cruise missiles, which are launched into the air and can fly a profile a bit like an aircraft, with a publicly acknowledged range of about 1,500 to 1,600 kilometres, so they can go far deep inland. And they will also be able to really act as motherships, if I can use that term, for uncrewed systems to be floated off the submarines.
Right.
And so as they operate, you can imagine a sort of a network of uncrewed submarines around the nuclear propelled submarine.
Okay, that's in the future, of course. And
Yes.
I know you've been a critic of Australia's current defence capabilities, and we've seen in the media generally a lot of debate about our procurement that seems to be spending a lot of money for very little result, take ages, changing priorities or changing minds. So what's going on? And is that a political or a bureaucratic problem?
It's a combination of the two, but politics always leads. And I think, the 30-second description, David, is that we've been stuck with a limit on how much money our governments are prepared to spend on defence. We are just kind of breaching the 2% of gross national product mark. And I have to tell you that for several years now, successive governments have had champagne appetites but beer budgets when it comes to spending money on defence. The risk with AUKUS, and in particular with the nuclear submarines, is that it's going to absorb so much of the defence budget, it's going to kill every other part of the organisation, unless governments are prepared to spend more than 2% of gross national product. The way I've described it, 2% of gross national product buys the defence force we have now, which is about 65,000 regulars. It's about 100 combat aircraft. It's about 11 surface ships, 6 submarines. That's what we know 2% buys.
But Peter, we couldn't even send one ship to the Red Sea when we were requested a few months ago. What happened?
I think we could have sent one, David.
Okay.
We chose not to. And what really happened there was that our government, I think, has suffered from a lack of confidence about the use of military force. We've been operating a frigate or a destroyer in the Persian Gulf until fairly recently for almost 20 years. I've been on one. I've been on the Parramatta as it did its patrols around Iraq. Our government could have chosen to do this, but it would have had to have been a much higher priority. And what Labor has done instead is that it's kind of narrowed the focus of our defence attention much more closely onto Southeast Asia and the South Pacific.
Right.
Whereas in contrast, coalition governments tended to take a sort of a forward defence view, which said that our security interests were much more deeply tied with the security of like-minded democracies, including in quite remote, relative to Australia, parts of the world.
Okay. All right. One of the things that's been in the news that's been of particular interest to the Australian Jewish communities is our universities, because part of the protests against Israel is that they're demanding I guess a divestment or a withdrawal of research activities that might be involved in weapons and that might be involved with Israel specifically. So can you tell us a little bit about what our universities are actually doing in the defence industry? I had no idea.
It's a very mixed picture. There are some universities or parts of some universities which are heavily invested and have been for a long time in different parts of science and technology research relating to military technology. So Adelaide University, for example, has some quite significant technology expertise around underwater systems, in particular optical systems. University of New South Wales is one of the world leaders in quantum computing technology, interestingly, originally funded by the American Army. But politically, I think there's two problems that have emerged. A lot of universities have decided that they simply don't want to collaborate with defence industry. And that has I think, stayed the hands of a lot of university administrators in working out how we might do that. This is going to be a problem for us because to make AUKUS work, we're going to have to graduate significant numbers of people with physics degrees, for example, that will be able to help operate these systems. Then you have the Israel issue, which is linked but separate, and I guess many people on the call will be aware that universities, or at least people inside elements within universities, have taken quite strongly anti-Israeli approaches, and it kind of crosses together in the defence industry space. The most recent example, David, was Sydney University, I think, where the senior leadership of the university quite unwisely agreed. I just think this is bizarre, frankly.
Yeah.
That in order to get some of those students out of their encampments, they were going to give them access into vetting university research that might have defence contracts related to it. I mean, I just think that was an appalling lapse of judgment on the part of Sydney University. If I can, just on the university point very quickly, that there's a bigger problem, and that's China. Our universities have become so invested in terms of fees from foreign-speaking students, of which the largest component is Chinese, and in collaborative scientific work driven by Chinese research institutions, which makes them extremely difficult for defence organisations to cooperate with, and which also leads to a mining of Australian intellectual property in the Chinese military-industrial sector. Our universities have been really reluctant to deal with that.
We find that whole field really very, very odd. AJA exposed, for example, some university collaboration with Iran on drone research. So that's another one that we've found.
In my day in defence, I recall there was quite serious concern about Iranian postgraduate students working in areas related to nuclear technology, and a sort of a roundup was done, shall we say, to kind of put some limits on that. The university sector will argue that you can't put constraints around intellectual freedom and free research. The national security sector will argue that increasingly this is where potential enemies like China and Iran are looking for comparative advantage. And so, like the Americans, we are now going through a process of trying to harden some aspects of our universities to prevent this leaking of information to potential enemies. And that's not always welcomed on campus.
We exposed last week, I think, beginning of last week, that the government is providing a set of scholarships to people who work for the Palestinian Authority to come to Australia. And one of the subjects they can study here is called Digital Economy and Cyber Security. So we'll be showing them.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. I think someone's got to get control.
We should limit them to sociology courses or something like that, David. I don't know, but
history, language.
Clearly, there's a problem here, and as a person that kind of started and then stopped being an academic, I think one of the real issues here is the distaste with which so many universities have for our national security sector. I think what will happen is that you'll ultimately find some Australian universities will decide that they're going to go down that path, and they will be prepared to have security clearances for academics, and they will be secure research facilities. Right. And there will be others that throw their lot in with China and elsewhere, and they will be untouched untouchable from a defence perspective.
We probably have to talk to the Education Minister and Defence. I don't know. One of the other things that's been in the media some months ago is a bit of a woke culture by some of our senior defence managers, let me put it that way. The gender stuff, etc., in the ADF. What can you say about that?
It's mostly greeted with dismay by people inside the defence organisation. I think that the ADF is not the right vehicle for sort of experiments in social policy. There was an incident at ADFA, my old campus, last year where cadets were told that they needed to dress in purple to demonstrate their alignment with the LGBTI community, and that being in uniform was not going to be appropriate on that particular day. That was something that was actually pushed back on and I think stopped. Defence needs to be a sort of an equal opportunity employer for people who want to serve in the military. It ought to be possible for them to do so. But I think it's not appropriate for the military to be treated as a sort of a vehicle for social experimentation. And I think some inside the defence organisation, including in senior leadership levels, and some inside the sort of personnel areas of defence that can make careers doing this have allowed this to become too embedded in what needs to be a different culture. Defence needs to have a culture of being a war-fighting organisation. And that might sound a little jarring to people that don't think about these things, but it's the one part of the Australian government system that has to have that ethic. That's how military organisations work, and the civilians who support them, like I did, have to support that concept of a war-fighting organisation. So wokeness and defence doesn't work well together, and I think it's caused some serious problems in the ADF recently.
Now, Australia and Israel have actually had some collaborations in defence technology, in intelligence. Israel's not part of the Five Eyes, but has helped Australia on a range of issues. How would you describe the relationship over say the last few years?
Inadequate, to be frank. It could be better and should be better. There has been some positive outcomes through defence technology, different aspects of Israeli defence industries coming here, and they need to operate as any other industry does on the basis of the quality of their products, which in the case of Israel are good, and they need to treat that with a commercial approach. I've been disappointed that we've not done more in a sort of official to official level or military to a military level to grow what seems to be a fairly natural point of collaboration. Yeah. There's been some resistance to that. DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs, has not been keen to see defence build closer relations.
That's a fascinating observation, because from a political perspective, we know that there are some issues in DFAT, and they've been very influential in helping the current government shift away from Israel and become quite hostile, frankly.
Yes, and look, there's a bunch of reasons why that happens. It's partly a numbers game, David. I remember when we were campaigning for a seat on the Security Council that, I was often told as a senior defence official we had to be mindful of the Arab vote to get that position. That's a factor. Then I think, we are talking about people who are the products of the education system that we've just discussed, who are coming into positions. And a certain amount of the senior civilian leadership of defence actually comes from DFAT. And so, you know, that's had an impact as well. I would like to see a closer relationship, more intelligence collaboration, particularly swapping finished intelligence. As you've said, there has been good intelligence collaboration in the past, been very beneficial for us. I think there's more we can do to understand each other better, and really the only way you do that is with more contact. And you need a government to kind of create permission for defence organisations to enable those connections to be made and sustained.
Yep. Peter, I will finish off this part with just asking about two sort of political issues that overlap. A big concern for Israel is Iran, and there was an extraordinarily powerful statement made by the chief rabbi of South Africa in the last couple of days, basically saying that Israel is going to have to strike Iran's nuclear capability because it's getting closer and closer to having nuclear weapons, and that can't be allowed to happen. From the perspective of a defence expert, is that doable? I mean, they've got deep underground facilities now, and it seems to me to be a much more complex mission than when Israel took out the nuclear reactor in Iraq in the 1980s.
Yeah, I would agree with it. It's a much tougher military target because the Iranians have done everything they've done in the last 20 years has been designed to make it a much tougher target. And I think it would be very difficult for Israel, as capable as the Israeli military is, to prosecute a campaign like that, absent very strong and direct support from the United States around intelligence, bomb damage assessment, and the capacity to go back and hit targets again. So I'm not well enough placed to know, is it doable or not. I think what I would say is that it would have to be a last gasp, absolute exercise of desperation for an Israeli government to decide to do that, having exhausted every other opportunity available to itself through cyber means, through covert operations and other activities to damage the campaign. And most particularly, you're going to have Washington on side to enable it to happen. Now, that may be possible, right? Things that happen at the sort of deep level of those connections between Israel and Washington tend to be more important than some of the surface nonsense that one sees by posturing politicians. But it's by no means easy, and I think it would have to be on the basis of Israel perceiving a direct, immediate existential threat, and at which point every means possible is going to be necessary. But short of that, it's a really hard target.
Okay, the last political question I want to ask you is a domestic one. This government seems to have not only turned against Israel, but in some degree against the Jewish community locally. We've seen it in a whole variety of ways, not taking adequate action on the rise in anti-Semitism, the sort of harassment on the streets. What do you think is driving that? Why has Labor turned on us in this way, and what can be done?
So, David, I'm a sort of a friend and an observer, and I'm conscious that I don't want to sort of outweigh my welcome by sounding too strong in my comments on these things. But all I can do is offer an opinion, and I'd be delighted to hear people react to it. This is what I think I see. I think Labor has walked away from the Jewish community in Australia. And I think for a number of reasons that is going to be a long-term factor. And I think it's driven by two things which have kind of been brought together. One is a Labor tendency to think about, I'm going to use the term ethnic communities here, but just bear with me, to think about ethnic communities as voting blocks. And so they think about Muslim communities in Australia, not as an aggregation of individuals with different aspirations and hopes and all of these sorts of things, but as a group that can be moved to vote for Labor if Labor promotes certain policies. And on the numbers, the Muslim communities of the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, frankly, become a more important target for Labor. And I think that's a large part of what's happened. The second factor is kind of different, and that is to say we've seen Labor has changed quite significantly in the time I've been working in this town. It's gone from being a kind of a social democratic party where you had serious-minded, thoughtful individuals concerned about national security and international affairs, right? I'm talking about Bob Hawke and Kim Beazley and a whole bunch of other folk like that, and more recent people, David Feeney, Stephen Conroy, a bunch of people like that. They are fewer and fewer in the Labor Party today, and they have been replaced by people that have what I will call a progressive kind of green left ideology, which is anti-American, anti-defense, and anti-Israel. And you see these things kind of coming together, I think, in the protests we've seen on our streets, you know, this sort of weird alignment of extremist Islamist ideologues with green left progressives, you know, the kind of the giving rise to the absurdity of the gays for Hamas kind of ideology. Now, Labor has been in a fight for its soul over quite some time now, between that old social democratic origin and a green left progressive ideology, which is not conducive to supporting Israel. And I think that the fight that Labor faces now is more on its left than its right, to sort of avoid going down the path of the Greens.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, the Australian Jewish community, for both those reasons, are casualties. And if that assessment is right, I think the only thing that's going to change Labor's thinking is if it is actually made to understand in no uncertain terms that members of the Jewish community are going to punish Labor at the ballot box at elections, because electoral politics is the only thing that actually will change the argument here. Now, I've sort of vented on this line before, and people have said to me, well, that's crazy because look at the number of Muslim voters, look at the number of Jewish voters. That's the wrong way to think about it, because my view here is that what shifts every election is a handful of votes in a handful of marginal seats, which can be determined by 100 votes, 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes. So it's not about the sheer weight of different populations. And so therefore, if I was trying to get Labor to think differently about how to deal with Israel and about how to deal with Australians of Jewish background, I'd be hitting them at the ballot box. I would, in the 6 or so months we have before an election campaign, be looking at the top 8 or 10 marginal Labor seats, where most damage could be done by people who wanted to go out and campaign against Labor, to say that their policies that they are adopting towards the Middle East are inappropriate, and the sort of lackadaisical lack of serious attention to the anti-Semitism which we're seeing rise in Australia is also inappropriate, and Labor should be punished for that reason. Now, what do I see amongst my Jewish friends? I see a lot of very nice, thoughtful people who are kind of stunned by what's happened, not just on October 7, but stunned by what's happened in Australia since that time, who aren't necessarily thinking in the sort of very hard political terms that I've just been advocating. nevertheless, that's my view. And when we get to Q&A, I'll be very pleased to hear why I'm wrong, if that's what people think I am. But
We'll open.
Thanks for the chance for sharing that idea.
I wanted to hear from you. We'll open Q&A in just 1 minute. I'll just do our 1 minute commercial break, as we do each week. If you're not yet actively supporting AJA, at the end of this event, go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, make a donation, make sure you've signed up to the emails, follow the social media. Just to show you what's coming up next week, we have a member of the Knesset, Ohad Tal, who's the chair of the Israel-Australia Parliamentary Friendship Group in Israel, and he'll be giving us a briefing on what's happening from the perspective of the Knesset. So, Robert, back to you to manage questions, please.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so to start, Peter, I just want to ask, we've had a few people approach us privately that they're in the defense import-export game, and they say that there's been some restrictions placed by the government. Maybe they haven't all been announced, but certain deals are being held up. And from what we've heard, this negatively impacts Australia more than Israel, actually, because, it's things that need to be, permission needs to be given to export it to Israel, so a tiny change can be done. So Australia can import it. Have you heard anything about that, or do you have any comments you could make?
Yes, this was an issue that came up in parliamentary estimates hearings a month or two ago, and the impression I got from that is I would not be putting too much hope on the idea of getting export approvals for defence equipment going to Israel under this government. And I just think it's become a casualty of that broader sense of the political push towards the pro-Palestinian policy position.
Well, yeah, that's a bit.
I guess perhaps I should just expand a little bit to say that any piece of defence equipment or technology which has both military and civilian use has to get an export approval from defence to be exported. There are thousands and thousands of those approvals issued every year. There's probably a couple of hundred of those which are considered sensitive enough by the Defence Department that they go to a minister for approval. And the impression I got coming out of those estimates committee hearings was that anything that was related to Israel was going up to ministers for approval and not being approved. Now there may be some issues that relate to Australian technology, exporting to Israel a piece of equipment or a piece of technology which is Israeli origin, which then comes back to be used by the ADF. Perhaps those things are happening. But I feel sorry for my colleagues in defence industry because I think it's just going to be a bit of a thankless business in terms of the bilateral relationship for some time.
Wow.
All right, we're going to go to some questions. So just to remind everyone, just one question per person. Try to keep it brief. We've got a lot of people who want to ask questions and no statements. First up, we have Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Peter, the US is involved in a range of military pacts with countries around the world. And we saw President Biden send an aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean shortly after October 7. But do you think that these days the US would realistically honour any obligation to get heavily involved should one of their partners, for example us, be challenged militarily?
They sent 2 aircraft carriers, and I think Biden was actually pretty good on the big fundamentals until they began to get more pressured by the domestic political dimensions in the way that our own government has. I think if we find ourselves, or if Israel finds itself in an extreme situation with Iran, that America will do what's right. And indeed, we saw that with the way America and the UK and others came to the party to assist after with the Iranian drone attack. So I think the fundamentals remain pretty strong, and partly, Alan, that goes to my point about there's a sort of below the surface level of seriousness in the relationship, which I think will continue. But at the end of the day, not that you're asking for my advice, but I guess if I was giving gratuitous advice to Israel, it would be the same advice that I would give to the Taiwanese and the Ukrainians, which is any help you get from the Americans is great, but don't depend on them. The best defense is your own capacity to look after yourself. Well, of course, I know that's Israel's view. But no, I think I wouldn't give up on America yet, even under the Democrats.
Okay, next up, Anne.
Nice to have you, Peter. Enjoying it very much. Does the UK and the US government really trust our federal government, or is there a similar attitude as it was for Gough Whitlam in the 70s?
Look, I think the Biden administration being a sort of a left sort of social democrat thing, has extended as generous a hand to the Albanese government as they possibly can. But they are, under the surface, a little bit worried about what they think is a lack of commitment to our defence. And the benchmark test of that is the 2% of gross national product. The Americans think by now, if you Aussies were serious, you should be doing more. That's going to get worse, or American concern is going to get stronger if Trump finds himself back into the White House, because there is, I think Trump has got a nose for nonsense, and we'll see that an Australian promise on AUKUS goodness 10 years from now doesn't really make up for the lack of effort that is being made at the moment. With the UK, look, Keir Starmer is still finding his feet. There's a lot of British defence issues that Australia can help with, not least helping their shipbuilding industry to survive through co-design of the future AUKUS submarine. So I think the relationship will be good. As allies, we all need to be expecting more of each other, demanding more of each other to be better allies rather than cruising. At the moment, the feeling I have is Australia's being a bit too cruisy on defence, and sooner or later that's going to be noticed by our friends and allies.
Okay, next up, Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Look, quick background. I was 30 years in the Army, and I've seen more procurement snafus than I care to remember. But my question is, given that the 3-year electoral cycle isn't enough to affect real change, is there any percentage in professionalising procurement in the officer stream so that you don't have officers posted into SPOs and having rings run around them by the corporates?
Yes, I would love to see that. It amazes me that we've not invested more in training people how to do procurement effectively, both in the military and in the public service. It's not helped by the fact that our governments have different attitudes. So the Liberals don't like the public service. They want to see the public service cut. That means contractors come in to do at greater cost what public servants can do. Then you get Labor in. They don't like contractors, so they grow the public service, but new public servants are never going to be able to manage the complexities of equipment acquisition in the early stages of their career. So we need governments of left and right to get more serious about this. I think the big problem is that we've been playing a game with defence for 20 years. We've fought in the wars that we could afford to fight in without there being real heartland consequences for Australia. For the first time really since the Second World War, now we face a threat that actually is a serious threat to Australia, and that's China. And we can't mess around with that in the way that over a lot of my career I felt we were messing around on procurement. So we've got to get serious about it, treat it like it matters, because it sure as hell does, and get more professional by properly training the people that do this stuff. As you would understand, it's a professional business, right? amateurs can't just come in and pretend to be good at it.
So on that point, you mentioned China. We've had a few written questions. Basically, is war with China coming? How might that look? Someone's mentioned Jim Molan's book. So, how should Australia prepare? What might happen? How likely is it?
War with China is coming. It's not inevitable, but it's, I think, a 50-50 proposition in the next 10 years. It's all about China attempting to secure a position of regional dominance for itself before its own demographic and economic circumstances start to see China declining. I think we're past peak China already. And so the risk is, and I think this is something that Xi Jinping understands very well, is that he has a sort of use it or lose it moment coming with the Chinese military around Taiwan. Certainly in the American establishment, the expectation is 2027 is the year people keep putting forward as a time where the risk of conflict is greatest. There's no magic in that year. It's just the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army. But it kind of fits quite well because it sort of reflects the point at which the PLA will be at its strongest. And even now we see America, Japan, the Taiwanese themselves getting stronger. And that can become a bit of a preemption incentive for the Chinese to get in there. So our challenge is to strengthen deterrence, to put Xi Jinping into a situation where every morning he wakes up, he concludes, not today. Today's too hard. It's not worth trying this with Taiwan. But he is a supremely opportunistic individual, and if he thinks that he can bully or coerce his way into a military takeover of Taiwan and then possibly beyond, he'll do it. So I think the risk of conflict in the second half of this decade is actually significantly high, and it will involve Australia. We do not have a capacity to exit from our own region. And so when you hear academics and others saying, oh, we can dodge that bullet, it doesn't have to involve us, they just don't understand how a conflict of that nature is going to expand. It will most certainly involve us.
Okay, it's very worrying. Next up, we have Debbie. Would you like to ask your question?
You're on silent, Debbie.
Sorry, Debbie, you need to unmute again.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Peter. Glad to have you, at the session. My question is about Australia's defence, again with China. Now, Australia's got a very long coastline, and China has got positions all around Australia with their 99-year leases of various insignificant islands, and the fishing rights up near PNG. And I'm just wondering, like, supposing we did get the right sort of government and enough money going into defence and get the systems fixed up, is it possible to defend our entire coastline from, say if China decided to attack us?
Well, not for the resources that we're spending now. And I think, it's very interesting to see why China has been working so hard in the Pacific to build relations with Pacific Island countries. It's not because they love people from the Solomon Islands or the Solomon Islands hard wood is an essential strategic commodity. China is interested in building relations with the islands of the Pacific in order to complicate the task of the Americans to get over to the Western Pacific in time of conflict. In other words, if you want to understand China's military strategy, read about the Japanese Imperial Army in the 1930s and 40s, which again was all about, if you control the Central Pacific, you protect your homeland and make it hard for your enemies to attack you. That's why China is in the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu and Fiji and every other place. And the only solution for Australia is we have to invest in building those relationships ourselves. Most Pacific Islanders that I've ever met would far rather deal with Australia. In fact, you'll notice when there's riots in Honiara or Suva or Nuku'alofa, the first place that gets burnt down is Chinatown. But we have the church, we have rugby, we have people-to-people connections. We have a lot of things which align us more to what average Pacific Islanders want. And I think we have to build those connections much more fully. And we have to get over this idea that it's just Aussie niceness which is going to see the way forward. In a small Pacific Island country, if you're China, you can co-opt the top 200 leaders of that country very easily. It doesn't take that much money. And that's what they're trying to do. So we've got to be smarter, invest more. We need a bigger military and diplomatic presence in the region. If we put in the effort, we can defend ourselves. Absolutely we can, but not if we just coast it, which is what we've been doing for way too long.
And separately, some of these islanders are some of the most pro-Israel people in the world. So.
Yes, absolutely, and remain so, right? Including in UN votes and things of that nature. So it's a shared interest, right?
Yep. And next up, Shoshana.
Hello?
Hi.
Yeah, you can hear me. Hi, thank you so much. What's being done right now to increase the quality and quantity of new military recruits in Australia?
Well, we are failing to recruit the numbers that we need to keep the Defence Force at its current size. We're losing about 500 to 550 people out of the ADF every month. And these are highly experienced, trained people. Naturally, some people, of course, will go, but I don't think we're working hard enough to find the right reasons to keep those people in. I think we're failing to have the right recruitment strategies. And I think one reason for that is because our recruitment strategies have been driven by, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, sort of woke advertising agencies, which go for all of the wrong value sets that don't actually work with the kids that want to join the Australian Defence Force. I'm a cricket fan, and it's not surprising that some of the heaviest advertising for ADF recruitment happens during the cricket season. And if you look at those ads, it's things like, I can join the Army Reserve. It's only a week a month, and it won't alter my lifestyle. And I think to myself, well, if it won't alter your lifestyle, why are you interested in joining the Army Reserve? The people I work with in defence, both in the military and in the public service, are there because they have a sense of patriotism, because they want to defend the country, because they think there are values about being Australia which are worth defending. And it's not actually about the money proposition. Money is important, but it's not just about the money proposition. So we need to rethink how we're doing it. Right now, what I can tell you is that the ADF is shrinking. There are actually government plans in place that would have it grow to about 87,000 from about 65,000 full-time over the next decade. We are nowhere near meeting that target. In fact, we're going backwards right now.
Disaster. All right, next up we have Ruvain.
Hi, Peter. Peter, what are the chances of Turkey getting thrown out of NATO with all the threats that it's making lately?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, look, I'm by no means a specialist, right? So I'm kind of having to go only to a certain level of depth here. But I guess my observation would be, well, they haven't been thrown out yet. And I think that makes it very, very difficult for NATO to contemplate doing that. My view would be it's probably worth it to keep them in to some extent in order to try and moderate some aspects of Erdogan's behaviour. But, you know, the more one looks at the domestic politics of Turkey, the less promising it seems. But no, I don't I don't sense there's much in the way of a NATO impetus to push them out, and I would think that that's probably the right approach at the moment.
Okay, next up we have Anne.
Okay. Hopefully my test okay. So I have a question. With the death of one of Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, sorry, I can pronounce that. 3 out of 5 Hamas leaders have been eliminated. How soon is or IDF is to end the war now that 3 out of 5 leaders of Hamas is dead?
I think that the military value of continuing operations is diminishing rapidly in Gaza. I think that as far as I can see, the major military objectives, putting the hostages to one side, have been met. That is to say, they've degraded the vast bulk of the fighting capability of Hamas. What's left now, I think, is going to be a process that will be familiar to many Israelis of mowing the grass, having to use air power and special forces to go back in on a regular basis, where identifiable units can be found and destroyed. And then I think there is a broader task which is necessary to continue to go after the political and senior military leadership of Hamas wherever that's possible. But large-scale ground operations, I think, are becoming counterproductive and have been becoming counterproductive for Israel for quite some time, because for every battalion that's rendered ineffective, that continues to build a stronger international opposition to Israel's campaign. Sooner or later, all wars have to come to an end. And it seems to me there's bigger problems to deal with anyway up north. From a military perspective, I can't see that there's much continuing value in large-scale ground operations remaining in Gaza.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one last question. So, Dina, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Is it a concern that the Australian government is inviting Palestinian Arabs to come here and learn about cybersecurity?
Yes, of course. And I'm concerned about the significant numbers of people that were let through without security vetting, any effective security vetting in the early days of the war. It shouldn't be happening. We have very clearly allowed a cohort of radicalized individuals to build up in this country. Clearly not all immigrants. I mean, clearly some of these people are second generation, which is typically what happens, frankly, in terms of creating terrorist ideology. But yes, it is a concern, and we should be taking it more seriously.
I want to thank you, Peter, for a very informative session. Some worrying things, but some reassuring things. So very informative. We can see from the chat, everyone really enjoyed it and learned a lot. So thank you for joining us.
So, Robert, thank you. I often finish my my talks which usually are pretty grim and pessimistic, by saying that I'm also available for children's parties and bar mitzvahs. But I've enjoyed the discussion. It's a great pleasure to be talking with you all this evening, and thank you for asking me on the show, Robert and David. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
How should people follow your work? What's the best way? Social media?
I'm largely off social media, which is part of my defence training. I'm happy to share my email if people want to contact me, Peter A. Jennings @protonmail.com. Peter A. Jennings @protonmail.com. It's about the most secure email you can use. And so do that. Read The Australian, which I'm sure you are all doing also. And Google Strategic Analysis Australia, which will take you to the website that Michael Shoebridge and I maintain.
Thank you. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Look forward to seeing everyone next week with a member of Knesset, Ohad Tal. Have a good night.